G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with part 13 in my partial book reading of One Crowded Hour, Tim Bowden's biography of Neil Davis. Commencing chapter 15, Gooks, Dinks and Slopes. This is 18 and a quarter pages, so I'm going to break it up into 3 6-page readings. Here we have some of Neil Davis's insights into the way the war was waged and who thought what about whom. The Americans called their South Vietnamese allies Gooks, Dinks or Slopes. The Australian troops called them Noggies. The cultural gap between Westerners and Asians in Vietnam was awesome. Understanding was not helped by foreigners' bewilderment with the Vietnamese language. Hearing its sung vowels and glottal stops was, Donald Wise once said, like listening to ducks fucking. One tragic result of this cultural impasse was the inability of the average American soldier on a year's tour of duty to see a Vietnamese as a fellow human being. It was a situation that Neil Davis, with his compassion for all human beings, found a source of constant anguish. I found the Americans overall a terribly kind and thoughtful people. By 1966 there were 500,000 Americans in South Vietnam. Most of them were soldiers, but they were drawn from all walks of life, and there were many civilians too. They did have the milk of human kindness, and they were unfailingly courteous and helpful. But this behaviour related mainly to Westerners. They really didn't associate bombing or punitive action carried out against the South Vietnamese people living in Viet Cong-controlled areas as action against people. It was action against Gooks, Dinks or Slopes. The American soldier didn't understand what the Vietnam War was about, but that wasn't his fault. After a few months in the country, the fighting soldier knew more about the Vietnamese than his commanding officers. The American command was completely divorced from the realities of the situation. They saw it in totally conventional terms. There was a war to be fought, and you had to pursue that war in conventional terms and destroy the enemy. But they didn't understand who the enemy was. They could talk about all sorts of ideas for furthering the cause of human dignity in the Western world at the same time as they were blowing a village of people away right in front of your eyes. Moments of insight and concern did surface. One afternoon down in the Mekong Delta, Davis stood with a young GI from Kentucky, watching a village burning after an action. There were a few Viet Cong killed, but the entire village and the livelihood for hundreds of people were destroyed. This young GI from Kentucky had had 6 years of primary school education and, like his brother soldiers, had had no proper indoctrination from the army why he was fighting in Vietnam. As we watched the destruction of the village, he said, "I don't know. It seems to me that there's something wrong with this. We're killing these people in their own homes. What are we doing here?" He understood very well, but it took a long time for most Americans. Then their 1-year tour was up. Most American GIs understood that there was a great deal wrong with the war. Their commanding officers in general terms never did understand. The civilian pacification program, winning the hearts and minds of the people, could make some wondrous miscalculations. The unfortunate acronym WAMO did not foreshadow gentleness and subtlety. Davis recalls that one program was to distribute portable toilets to Vietnamese farmers who had been managing quite well with their own arrangements for several thousand years. In almost any large town in Vietnam, you could buy American Zippo cigarette lighters engraved with the WAMO slogan. I saw one with an extra comment engraved on the back: "Let me win your heart and mind or I'll burn your bloody house down." And that is what happened. Few American soldiers ever met their hard-fighting counterparts in the South Vietnamese army because each force operated independently, and even in combined operations they never actually integrated with each other's units. Effectively, the American soldier never met a South Vietnamese soldier. He was more likely to meet the Vietnamese hanging around the fringes of his base camp peddling sex, dope, or any commodity to grab a fast buck. When the GI went on leave to Saigon, he'd head for the bars, into the restaurants and brothels, so he'd meet more pimps and prostitutes or shoeshine boys and taxi drivers, whose main purpose at that time was to win quick dollars from the Americans. He got a distorted view of the Vietnamese character. He never really knew the farmer and the peasant in the field, the person he was killing most of the time. What little indoctrination the American soldiers received was that they were in South Vietnam to fight the communists because the South Vietnamese forces were incapable of doing so. That was totally wrong, of course, because the South Vietnamese proved themselves very good fighters, except they lacked assets like air support, helicopters, and artillery that the Americans took for granted. The Viet Cong guerrillas didn't share this view. They knew when the Americans were coming. All they had to do was watch the helicopters coming like a swarm of flies. Underneath the helicopters were the Americans, so they could literally run circles around them. There is no doubt that the American commander-in-chief in South Vietnam, General Westmoreland, was one of the most brilliant generals of modern times. He was a superb logistics expert, but as a tactician, fighting in Vietnam, he seemed completely at sea. He was fighting a conventional war on a massive scale, whereas the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese were running in and out of his hundreds of thousands of troops. He never could seem to locate them. Although there were 550,000 American soldiers in Vietnam at the height of the war, there were never more than 80,000 actually fighting. There were 10 non-competent troops backing up each fighting soldier in the field. So it was easy for the communists to sever their lines of communication, to cut their logistics, force them to resupply by air, and then bottle them up and decimate them piece by piece in the mountains or the paddy fields. The usual rifle used by the Americans was the M16, known to the Australian troops as the Armalite. It was a very sophisticated weapon, high velocity and hard hitting, so much so that if you were hit anywhere on your body by a round from an M16, you were either dead or very severely wounded. But being so sophisticated, it had faults. Often it would jam for a number of reasons. It had to be kept very clean, and that was very difficult in the jungle or paddy fields, where soldiers might be up to their waist in mud and slush a lot of the time. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese used the communist assault weapon, the AK-47. Russian designed and Chinese made, it was very reliable, but not as hard-hitting as the M16. Nor was it as accurate, but you didn't need accuracy in the type of warfare in South Vietnam. But it was easily kept in working order and would keep working in the mud and slush and general wear of a tropical country where the M16 didn't. The M16 caused the death of many Americans. The M16 caused the death of many Americans. I remember seeing one platoon of 32 men that had been wiped out. 19 of those soldiers were lying there with their weapons half stripped down or jammed, which meant that 19 out of 32 men died without being able to offer any resistance. The communists had another advantage. They could use captured American ammunition, but the reverse was not possible. Big claim, but it turns out it only applies to mortars. The communists used 61mm mortar, the Americans 60mm. So if the Americans captured enemy mortar bombs, they would not fit down the tubes. On the other hand, the communists could make use of the American ordnance. The Americans actually employed a device called a people sniffer. It was carried by helicopters or low-flying aircraft over jungle areas, and it responded to the exact body temperature of a man, 98.4 degrees Fahrenheit, 36.8 Celsius. But it didn't always work out. Many a time the Americans went scorching in with a bombing raid after the people sniffer had scented men, only to find they'd wiped out a herd of water buffaloes or a few elephants. The communists had a few technical tricks too. The Americans were very dependent on their thousands of helicopters, not only to move troops and supplies about, but to get their wounded to hospitals. During the spring offensive of 1972, American helicopters became terribly vulnerable to a small heat-seeking rocket only a metre long, which could be carried and fired by an infantryman. If it were fired in the direction of a helicopter or low-flying aircraft, it homed in on the heat of the exhaust. It took a great toll for a while. Apart from the loss of life, most of the helicopters being downed were worth $1 and $2 million each. The Americans had to think of something quickly, and they came up with what we called the stove boat. It looked like a country shack gone wrong, with a chimney stove arrangement, which extended from the actual exhaust and took it out in an L to an S shape at the back of the helicopter. They still got a nasty jolt in the helicopter because the rocket would still explode just outside, but it did the job for the time being. Most civilian casualties in the field occurred in what the Americans and the South Vietnamese designated free fire zones. These areas were categorised as being under communist control, so everybody inside the zone was by definition a communist or a sympathiser. They were therefore likely to be killed in the open, even if they were just farmers ploughing their rice fields. The Americans and the South Vietnamese had a so-called legal right to attack anything in that area by air, artillery, or by any other means. Many farmers and their families were killed in those free fire zones. They had nothing else. It was their home, their means of livelihood. If they left it for a refuge camp, it meant leaving land they had occupied for hundreds of years, as well as abandoning the graves of their ancestors. They didn't see any real reason why they should leave. No one likes living in a refugee camp, and they didn't consider themselves communists, so they were targets, and thousands of Vietnamese civilians died in this way. Davis was not surprised when the My Lai massacre was exposed, and the world suddenly had endless details about Lieutenant Calley's gunning down of unarmed, unprotected women and children. Oops. Lieutenant Calley's gunning down of unarmed, unprotected women and children. Well, that's your 6 pages and a bit. So, here endeth part 13 of One Crowded Hour by Tim Bowden. I shall return with the next episode in the series. Ciao.